the European Union nations that are already part of the European Union, including my own Ireland, but also in those that are coming in to the Union. She has already absolute control, for example, right across Poland. And so, just as in the past, she brought kings and princes to heel by her commands and dictates and her laws, she now brings nations under her control through civil law. In the past, she could and did remove people's oath of allegiance to their sovereign leader so that they were freed from their allegiance to the civil power if the civil power did not obey them. Such was her power. And since the 20th century, we have seen a strategy that is quite similar to the preparation in which she prepared for those centuries of torture and of persecution. And so we have a pattern. Just as before she got many kings and princes to sign on to her legal agreements, so particularly in the 20th century and in her own century, the 21st, she is again very strong in her bringing in her power through the civil law of nations. She does this primarily by what is called a concordat. A concordat is a civil agreement made between the Vatican and any particular nation. It guarantees the Roman Catholic Church with the right and freedom of her type of worship. It includes defining of things like doctrine, the establishing of Roman Catholic education and hospitals. It includes property rights, appointing of bishops, and the recognition of the Catholic law over marriage, particularly of the Catholic annulment. Such agreements have been made in the 20th century, and some of them really famous. Concordats in Latvia, 1922, Bavaria, 1924, Poland, 1925, Romania, 1927, Lithuania, 1927, Italy, the famous one with Mussolini, 1929, Baden, 1932, Austria, 1933, Germany, the same year, 1933, and Yugoslavia, 1935. The Vatican has preferred to do its civil agreements with its own dictators who are also Roman Catholic. And some of the most famous Vatican concordats or civil agreements have been made between the Vatican and dictators, for the most part whom were despots, who ruled Catholic nations. And I'd like to give you some of the more famous of these. Those who were Roman Catholic of the Catholic's own fold, that the Catholic did civil agreements with. Adolf Hitler in Germany from 1933 to 1945. Benito Mussolini in Italy from 1922 to 1943. Francisco Franco in Spain from 1936 to 1975. Antonio Salazar in Portugal from 1932 to 1968, Juan Perón in Argentina from 1946 to 1955, and Ante Pavelic in Croatia from 1941 to 1945. Each one of those nations has horrors all of its own. What happened through these civil concordats in the 20th century? It wasn't simply the millions of Jews, but the believers that suffered also under Hitler. And what the believers suffered under Franco and Mussolini, and probably the most gruesome torture to believers and to the Orthodox in Croatia has been some of the more horrific massacres and torture ever known on planet Earth under the civil agreements that the Roman Catholic Church had with Ante Pavelic in Croatia. Make your stomach turn even to read of them. The Vatican is also involved in multilateral diplomacy, that is, relationships with governmental organizations that are not nations, and there are many of these. She has influence and official position with the United Nations and its agencies, the Council of Europe, the European Communities, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Organization of American States, and such as the Organization of African Unity. They're just the principal governmental agencies where she has strong influence. She also participates in a long list of international, intergovernmental organizations, and it would take me about a half an hour to read out the whole list. Immense amount of organizations such as the Unification of Private Law, International Council on Grain, communications by satellite, and many other agencies where you would never expect that the Vatican is involved in. She has a foothold not just in governmental agencies but intergovernmental organizations. It was prior to 1989 that the Vatican mostly dealt with the European nations in concordat and civil agreements and our ambassadors, and mostly dealt with the Latin American countries of South America. But she now has civil agreements with most nations of the world. Some of these agreements of old still continue, like the agreement, concordat, that was hammered out and recognized in law between Pope Pius XII and Hitler, signed on July the 20th, 1933, where the Vatican gave its approval to the Nazi regime and never went back on her agreement, though millions of Jews suffered and millions of others. She gave her approval to the Nazis, and they approved of her law, and even things of money coming to the Vatican through civil agreements. And then Hitler was Catholic, and so were all the main men in his deadly machine that massacred right across Europe. 50% of the armies and air force of Hitler were Roman Catholics. The Vatican maintains civil relations with most nations on earth. And I'd like you to hear a quotation from Zenith, the official Vatican news agency that gives out official decrees and what's happening in the Catholic world. And I would urge you, in keeping track of the Vatican, that you keep track of Zenith, quite easy to find on the internet. She said on June the 20th, 2000, under a heading, "Virtually all countries have signed concordats with Rome." This Zenith agency said, quotation, "The desires of countries around the world to maintain stable relations with the Vatican is greater than ever. This is reflected in the extraordinary number of concordats that Rome has signed with other capitals over the last few years. From 1950 to 1999, 128 concordats were signed between the Vatican and different states. This figure was disclosed during an international congress organized by the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, which has presented in one volume all the concordats signed over the last 50 years. In the past 9 years, 43 concordats signed between the Vatican and other states. In part, this significant figure is due to the fact that with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the former communist countries hastened to establish diplomatic relations with Rome in order to change the Church's illegal status. This has led other nations of the Middle East, Asia, and Africa to knock on Rome's door and enter into judicial agreements. This marathon has implied an average of 19 concordats a year. End of quotation from Zenith Catholic News Agency. Now, it's not simply controlled through these concordats, but she has also influence through her papal nuncios. Papal nuncios are usually archbishops sent out as a civil ambassador to a nation, like we have papal nuncios to the United States of America, officially recognized in civil law. It is not only the USA, but 171 other nations besides the United States of America that has papal ambassadors. And usually the papal ambassador is the chairman of the Council of Ambassadors, because he claims to be the oldest state. So he is usually the one who chairs the meetings of all the ambassadors together. The Vatican is one of the few states that maintains diplomatic dialogue with such countries as Libya while maintaining relationships with Israel. And with the exception of places like China, Korea, and Vietnam, where it is difficult for her to have civil agreements, it is still noted that she has always had agreements with Havana, even through the difficult years. With Islamic nations, there are still some nations that have not signed on with the Vatican, of those nations controlled by the Muslims. Through her many civil ambassadors and her concordats with these nations, Rome is now quite ready to show her muscle again in bringing civil law to bear on believers. She gains much control through civil law, and we are amazed at how graphically and in what detail she fulfills what the Holy Spirit said in the written word